playbacks to determine beluga whale classifications of their own acoustic repertoire provides novel evidence for signature calls.
Sorry for the mouthful on that one.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. So beluga whales have been studied for decades, yet much is still unknown about their complex acoustic communication system. We do know that they produce dozens of vocalizations that fall into three broad categories. Tonal calls, which are often referred to as whistles, pulsed calls, and biphonated calls, which is when they produce two calls at once. Now, the question here is whether they have the context, looking at the contexts and the functions of these calls and what those may be. The only call that's really been studied in regards to this are their contact calls. These calls are usually produced during times of separation, and generally the number of calls reflects the numbers of belugas in that population at that time. However, whether this call holds individual identity and therefore shares a similar function to bottlenose dolphin signature whistles is still unknown. When we look at dolphin signature whistles, we as humans can fairly easily categorize them and discriminate based on the contour, which is the shape of the whistle. Now, let's take a look at beluga contact calls. It's a lot more difficult for us as humans just to look at this and visually tell you if individual identity is in that tonal component, pulse component, or if it needs to be a biphonation of the two, or if that's the only call that even has individual identity. So the question came about, how can we better determine which beluga calls contain individual identity? And the short answer is ask the whale themselves. So how did we do that? We worked with the Georgia Aquarium and their 5 whales aged 4 to 25, and we did habituation, dishabituation playbacks to ask about caller identity in 4 call types. The contact call, a biphonated RWS, which is an R-shaped whistle with that secondary pulsed component, a biphonated pulsed tonal, which again has that secondary pulsed component, and a biphonated flat whistle, which seems to have that secondary tonal component. So how did we test this? We presented the whale 3 calls from one whale and a 4th call from a different whale. And if they were to follow a normal habituation dishabituation pattern, we would see a high response level to the first call that would slowly decrease by the 3rd if they view all calls from the same whale as the same, and we would see an increase in response level to the 4th call should they view that different caller as different, and call type stayed the same during these sessions. To look at their behaviors, we looked at the number of times that they looked at the underwater speaker after the underwater playback had commenced. So what did we find? When we tested our contact calls, while an untraditional habituation pattern came about, there was still a significant habituation between the 2nd and the 3rd, and then there was, most importantly, a significant dishabituation, or an increase in response level on the 4th call, which is our different caller, suggesting that they can tell between same and different in caller when it comes to this call type. We then looked at our biphonated RWS, and we saw that with our current data set, it's trending in the pattern of a habituation-dishabituation pattern once again, suggesting that there's a possibility this call may also have some form of individual identity. We then looked at our biphonated pulse tonal, and again, we found significance in habituation versus dishabituation, suggesting that they can tell individual identity versus some aspect of this call. Interestingly enough, when we looked at our biphonated tonal flat whistle, the only call without those vertical pulses, we did not find a pattern of habituation or dishabituation, possibly suggesting that there's not evidence that this call has some form of individual identity in it. So, what do we find from all of that? What can we conclude from our findings? First, it shows that belugas respond pretty well to these standardized playback experiments that have been done with bottlenose dolphins, which opens the door to significantly more questions that we can ask the whales themselves instead of just guessing from our human perspective. It also finds that there's evidence of individual identity across multiple call types as long as they have that shared broadband vertical pulsed component, which again, we'll have to test more calls, but that's what we're finding so far. It also shows that having a newly applied technique of asking the beluga themselves instead of us humans trying to categorize and guess ourselves is pretty good at understanding their own repertoire and telling us based on their responses. So I'd like to thank my funders as well as those who have worked with me and everybody else who has made this possible.